U.S. Global Change Research Program's webinar series on climate, food, and culture, hosted by the Social Science Coordinating Committee. My name is Ariella Zeikerman, and I'm a program manager and social scientist in the Climate Program Office at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, better known as NOAA. I'm also the co-chair of the USGCRP's Social Science Coordinating Committee, and on behalf of the entire committee, we're so pleased to host this series and have you all with us. Next slide, please. The U.S. Global Change Research Program began as a presidential initiative in 1989. It was mandated by Congress in the U.S. Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. It's overseen by the Subcommittee on the Global Change Research, composed of representatives from each of USGCRP's 13 member agencies, and you can see the logos of those federal agencies on the bottom of your screen. Next slide. The Social Science Coordinating Committee is one of multiple interagency working groups that work to support the USGCRP. The mission of the committee is to foster the integration of the methods, findings, and disciplinary perspectives of the social, behavioral, and economic sciences and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches that include those sciences into the USGCRP activities. The committee serves as a social science resource to other USGCRP interagency working groups, the Subcommittee on Global Change Research, and other USGCRP activities like the National Climate Assessment. The Food, Culture, and Climate webinar series is one effort by the committee to highlight the ways in which a wide variety of social science research considers climate change in a sociocultural context. It also is an attempt to draw attention to the humanistic frameworks that shape how we understand the complex and diverse ways individuals, households, and communities experience climate change. So I'm pleased to hand over the seminar to Dr. Emily Brooks, a scientist in the Natural Hazards Mission Area of the U.S. Geological Survey, and who will be moderating today's discussion. Emily?
Thanks so much, Ariella, and I'd like to echo Ariella's welcome to everyone for joining us for this conversation. We're so glad you're here, and we look forward to hearing from our wonderful speakers. Could I have the next slide, please? As Ariella said, this webinar series really focuses on experience and how communities experience climate change, how the impacts of climate change are felt and understood, how they interact with other stressors, and how they amplify existing inequities and vulnerabilities within communities. And we chose food as a focal topic for this series because of its universality. Food is something that everyone needs to survive. It is a human right, and its availability, producibility, and consumability can be used as an indicator for human well-being, change, vulnerabilities, and inequalities. Now, the impacts of climate on food, and specifically agriculture, are well documented, particularly in the natural and physical sciences. But we know that food is not just a biological outcome. From production to consumption, food is embedded in sociocultural systems. It is representative of so much more within those systems. This series builds on past efforts by the USGCRP to understand how people are at the center of interactions between climate change and food. For example, the report that you see on your screen, Climate Change, Global Food Security in the U.S. Food System, unpacks how climate change already does and will continue to affect the availability and accessibility of food in a variety of ways. So in this series, we dig deeper into the meaning of food by using a sociocultural lens and research methods that highlight the experiences of communities, their values, their norms, their attitudes, and their beliefs, their life ways, and the systems that shape and are shaped by them. This focus on meaning, experiences, and systems allows us to understand climate change at that human scale, what can be lost, why it matters, and to whom, but also how communities adapt and build resilience in the face of climate change. While on the one hand, the focus on food in this webinar series will offer real, tangible understanding of food systems and their relationship to climate through specific social scientific examples, food in some ways is also a proxy. It's a cultural example for asking much larger questions about interconnected human experiences. Next slide, please. And to that end, the series as a whole has two guiding questions that really center humans at the core of climate science. You'll see those questions on the screen. What are examples of sociocultural practices and systems, and how are they impacted by climate change? And how can sociocultural knowledge be applied to effectively build resilience to and adaptive management for climate change? Next slide. Now you're sitting in the second of 3 seminars. Our first seminar, Sociocultural Approaches to Climate, Food, and Agricultural Systems, focused on land-based systems and experiences and approaches. Today's seminar, Sustainable and Just Fisheries, Rethinking Climate Resilient Food Systems, continues the discussion on these themes, applying them to fishers and fisher communities, as well as larger discussions of coastal communities, marine resources, and ocean management. And the third seminar, Putting Culture into Practice, the Role of Social Science in Building Resilient and Adaptive Food Systems, builds on the first two to ask the question of how practitioners apply social science research and sociocultural frameworks to their own work. All 3 webinars feature corresponding themes woven across the events, and we hope that you will consider joining us for the entirety of the series. If you're not able to join us for one webinar in particular, the recordings will be sent out together at the end to everyone who registered and will be featured on our website. So please do register to get those in your inbox. Next slide. With that, I will start by introducing our expert panelists for our conversation today. And for each of our panelists, I will ask our speakers to share a brief explanation of what they do, what they're interested in, and to respond to a starter question for today. From your perspective, what are the critical intersections and relationships between climate, food, and culture? And we'll be starting with Dr. Monica Barra, who's with the University of South Carolina. Monica, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and I'm just excited that you're making the space for this and to ask these questions and bring this group of people together. I think it's very important. So I wanted to start with that. So hello, I'm Monica Barra, and I am a cultural anthropologist by training, and I'm also an assistant professor in the School of the Earth, Ocean, and Environment and the Department of Anthropology with an affiliation in African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. It's quite a mouthful, but in many ways, my appointment in multiple fields is really reflective of the nature of the research that I do, which rests at the intersection of environmental studies, cultural anthropology and geography, and questions about racial inequality in the context of climate change. So over the past 5 or 6 years, I've been looking at these questions through the lens of communities brought together by coastal land loss in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast in the US here. And I've done that with 2 primary groups. I've worked first with scientists, geologists, ecologists, wetland biologists, engineers, who are all in some way or another involved in efforts to develop aspects of the state's plan to address and hopefully restore disappearing wetlands in Louisiana. And secondly, I've been working alongside African American, Creole, and mixed race fishing communities in Southeast Louisiana, just along the kind of last 100 miles of the Mississippi River below New Orleans, where some of the largest and most ambitious environmental restoration projects are slated to be happening, where the state actually proposes to reroute large sections of the Mississippi River into subsiding wetlands in an effort to hopefully kind of restore natural land building processes in the Delta and really kind of provide a measure of long-term environmental protection for all of Southeast Louisiana. So for me, my interest kind of broadly in working between these 2 groups as an anthropologist was to really kind of understand how the histories of these Black coastal communities, these Black fishing communities, who are largely the descendants of people who were enslaved and working on regional sugar plantations when all of Southeast Louisiana was predominantly dominated by that landscape, how their histories are kind of intersecting with the kind of broader history of science and engineering and basically redesigning the lower landscape of coastal Louisiana. So I really wanted to try and think about racial histories and histories of engineering and environmental science together. And mainly to kind of pose this question about to what extent do we see histories of race-based and class inequalities being formulated in relation to how we've managed the environment. And then in turn, if this is the case, right, what those patterns are and how we can, more or less avoid trying to repeat those same patterns into the future as as the state of Louisiana, once again embarks on a very large attempt to use science and engineering to once again reconfigure the coastal landscape. So to me, those are really the intersections I've been working at. Now, in terms of the question, and I just want to make sure I stay on time here. So, I'm going to think about this through the lens of my own work. So, trying to understand what we can learn from fishing communities about the kind of nature of how environmental systems are ultimately kind of social and cultural systems as well. When I started digging into the history of the fishermen working in Southeast Louisiana in these communities, one thing I learned really quickly is that a lot of the fights for civil rights, equity, and inclusion in many of these, again, they're very rural coastal fishing communities, have been fought on the grounds of access to and use of coastal lands and waters. So on the slide here, there's this mural here is actually of a community leader who was an oysterman, who basically worked with members of the community to try and fight discriminatory oyster leasing practices in Southeast Louisiana to basically pave a way for a lot of the Black fishermen to start working for themselves and supporting themselves in their communities and basically getting off kind of larger boats where they were, low wage laborers for other people. So I want to kind of at least point this out because it was one of the ways, at least for me in my work, that it became very evident how the ways we manage and understand the environment can be connected to these other kinds of histories that seemingly feel entirely separate, such as the fight for equity and inclusion for Black communities in the South. And it's something that really, I hope can kind of add a little bit to this conversation we're having here to really think about how these kinds of communities and their relationships to water show us that it can be ultimately more than just, the environmental factors here, but it's actually tied into these bigger histories for fighting for inclusion and justice and equity. So with that, I will leave it to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monica. And if we can have the next slide, please. I will turn it over to Cynthia Grace McCaskey with East Carolina University.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And I want to echo Monica's comments about thank you for doing this webinar and for inviting me. I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say. So I am an applied environmental anthropologist. I'm currently at East Carolina University. My position is with the Department of Anthropology and the Coastal Studies Institute. My research focuses primarily on small-scale fisheries, mostly island-based, and I've worked in the Caribbean as well as the Western Pacific. Prior to coming to ECU, I worked for NOAA Fisheries out in Hawaii, and now I've been at ECU for about 6 years. But I think this gives me an interesting perspective because I have both an applied agency-based background as well as now academic background in terms of research, funding, collaboration. So in terms of resilience, my work is focused on fishing community resilience to some extent in post-disaster contexts, such as hurricanes, flooding. But I've also worked with non-fishing marginalized communities here in North Carolina on aspects of community resilience. I'm currently working with the town of Princeville, which is the oldest town founded by Blacks in the country, yet faces continual threats and has experienced catastrophic flooding due to heavy rains. And I guess two points about my research in general. One is that much of my work is interdisciplinary. I work with biologists, ecologists, economists, engineers, I mean, really across the board. And I teach and advise students in our Integrated Coastal Sciences PhD program. So I have a lot of experience thinking about and trying to implement ways to conduct truly interdisciplinary environmental research in which the non-economic social sciences, are not just a tag-on or an afterthought, which in my experience tends to be something that happens quite frequently, unfortunately. And second, most of my work is grounded in community engagement or other aspects of participation and processes, including resource users, stakeholders in the general public, including them in management as well as in science, co-production of knowledge, citizen science, etc. And using typically a political ecology approach, I'm focusing on determining and working to break down some of the political, social, and economic barriers that are in place and that actively exclude resource users and others from participating in these processes. Now, to focus on the question, in terms of why it's important to understand the role that fishing communities play, I particularly related to climate change. I think it's fishers and fishing communities are the ones that are, living, working, using the resource on a daily basis. So they see these changes in a way that those of us who are not living and working on the water every day cannot. So I think it's really important to figure out how to include that information and that experience and knowledge in a meaningful way. And I think a lot of progress has been made over the last, say, 20, 30 years on this, but I think we're still only breaking the surface, and much of our management processes, much of our policy, still puts primary focus on quantitative data and economic data, which, if I'm a fisherman who's been fishing in multiple generations, that's not the type of knowledge I necessarily have to bring from my lived experience. So, and I will leave it for that for now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grace McCaskey. If we could have the next slide. Our next speaker is Dr. Yoshitaka Alta with the University of Washington, and I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to save the time to say thank you, but for the organizers and my wonderful co-panelist, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Yoshi Alta. I'm a research assistant professor at School of Marine and Environmental Affairs in University of Washington, but I'm also the director of Ocean Nexus Center in University of Washington Earth Lab. So my work is pretty much a teamwork with over 11 institutes and 17 colleagues working together under this Ocean Nexus umbrella, and they just pretty much all over the place, as you can actually see it. Not really, but those are photos of my colleagues. But let me just explain what Ocean Nexus is doing, which pretty much summarizes what I do. So if you can just see this kind of like a purple diagram and drawings underneath, and in my slide, you can start from its left, which says human activities are affecting the oceans and the coastal lines. So if we think about the climate change and the global impact and the other issues, it's pretty obvious this is what's happening. And next one, it says pollution and ecological damage creates injustice and disparity, which is really what we have been recognizing and understanding emerging issues, and has been there all the time, but I mean more for with climate change and other response to the climate change. And the problem that we see is this disparity or inequality widening because of the climate change, and because of our response to the climate change really calls us to approach ocean governance. So how we actually govern ocean in a sort of like a different way. And so my center really trying to put social equity as the center of the ocean governance. And I know there are natural scientists and people in the audience who might just, start saying like, okay, yeah, social equity is important. But what we are saying is social equity is equally important to the biodiversity and conservation of the habitat. So, this is a little bit of a challenge for everyone, maybe to suck up, but there you go. So what we really trying to do is put the social equity in the middle. So how are we going to do it? We have three all that we like to put as kind of like a guiding principle of this research center. First is recognize, which is basically recognize the impact that we all do, but we also recognize what we have done wrong and what the harm we have caused in the coastal communities and people who are marginalized and underserved. And that's the first thing. The recover, again, we have to recover those environment which has been hurt and those social systems which has been collapsed, but we also have to understand that we need to recover the governance system. Much of the privatization and the deregulation is happening everywhere. We really want to bring ocean back to where it's supposed to be and how to govern it. Thirdly, reverse. Yes, for the climate change, it takes time, and we are at a tipping point every day. You've probably heard on the news every day about this. But we also have to reverse this power inequality. There's a person and then there's the who's actually in the face of the issues, but really doesn't really have enough power to just solve it. Or sometimes the agency has been taken away from the coastal communities. We need to reverse this. And as a result, we're hoping to close this gap between of inequality and really bring oceans for all people. Maybe we have a sustainable ocean. Maybe we have a beautiful ocean. Maybe we have an ocean full of biodiversity. But if it's not for everyone, that's not the ocean what we want. And then that's the vision what we are thriving for. So, so I'm kind of like I'm a social anthropologist by training. But so I'm living in this culture of the scientists, both social and the natural. We tend to think there's a culture and then climate change and the food and the ocean done in the coastal communities and, people who's working with fish. But we also have to realize the scientists and policymakers and the people working in the government, we carry also about our own culture, our own tendencies, our prejudice, and our own concerns, which is culture driven. So we really need to understand and being reflective about what has been done and how we actually think. And then I think that's really important if we think about the culture. And the other thing is, so I've been working in coastal communities starting from Palau, and I worked with English fishermen, and I worked in Japan and various places, and really getting on a board and understanding stuff and working with them and trying to understand what's their concerns and what's coming in the future. And I actually see that reality and what we actually call as a global, which we often kind of like hear when we actually put the oceans and the cultures and climate change on the table. There's a huge gap. And I see that gap has been unfortunately reflected upon, some of the stuff and the movement which has been going on internationally, such as blue economy, SDGs or 30 by 30 or decade of the ocean science. It's really governed by this sort of like a culture of the scientists, culture of certain people who actually in a place where they had a power to change. And I feel that if we have something we need to learn from fishing communities, how we're going to reverse this structure and really bring the voice of the people and putting on ocean governance. And that's what I'm hoping that we can contribute as a center and I can contribute as an individual. Thank you.
So much, Yoshi. And last but not least, I will introduce our final expert panelist. We could have the next slide, please. And Dr. Patricia Pinto de Silva, I'll invite you to share your introduction. And Patricia, if you're speaking, you might be muted.
Yes, I am. So thank you so much, Yoshi, for that and for the other introductions. I'm just so energized by everything that the folks before me have said, and I'm very appreciative of the organizers in putting this together. This definitely makes me feel more a part of a community of people who are thinking about these issues around food, culture, climate. So thank you so much for bringing us together. My name is Patricia Pinto de Silva. I'm a social scientist at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. It's one of the regional science centers at NOAA Fisheries, which is part of NOAA. And within NOAA Fisheries, I'm one of about 12 staff social scientists that conducts research on the human dimensions of wild-caught recreational and aquaculture fisheries in the United States. And I think that's about out of a staff of about 4,000, but I may be wrong. I've always been interested in this. It's sort of been something that if you had asked me when I was 15, I wouldn't have known, but now looking back, I see the roots of it starting very young. I'm first generation American of Portuguese descent. I think I have saltwater in my veins. My fondest and really deepest held positive memories for me are from coastal Portugal and its seascapes, its small fishing towns, the smell of sardine skin, grilling on an outdoor wood fire, and everything that came along with that, family, friends. And as I grew up, I really started to understand that sense of identity and the role that fishing played in connecting the Atlantic-facing people of Portugal. You know, a lot of people think of it as a country that's, you know, certainly not an island, but when you're there, it does feel like it is more of an island, Atlantic-facing. And the seafood they love, and to the canneries, auction houses, fish markets, and food traditions that provide them access to it. It's maybe like Japan obsessively into fish and enjoying it together. The other thing that really shaped me and shapes my thinking about these questions even now was a chance I had as a newly graduated an undergraduate in political science. I moved to Brazil, sort of lost and looking for something, but I definitely found whatever it was I was looking for. I lived in a little fishing village where fishing wives would come to my house to give me fish because they were sort of wondering and worried about why I was there and how I could sustain myself. This was in Rio Grande do Norte. And I spent about a year and a half there, and I listened and I learned and I watched so much about traditional ecological knowledge, land-sea connections of the raft fishermen and the small sailboat fishermen, their seasonal rounds, and their interplay between power, poverty, and environmental policies. I also learned a lot about class, race, and power of listening. And most importantly, I learned about the power of community. Spending time outside of the United States actually also taught me very much about my own culture as an American and what it's like to live here, and those aspects of race and power and culture here. And that's an amazing experience. Since then, you know, I did my academic work, and I've covered a lot of research on collaborative management, community participation, power, and more recently have focused my work on food systems and public health. And partly that's because I realized that it's not enough to look at fishermen and access. It's also, we need to understand the connections between fishermen and their access and their use of marine systems in order to understand the connections between the larger societal outcomes of these management systems and their connections to the marine environment. As a social scientist within NOAA, I feel like it's my role and responsibility to help mainstream this type of work and thinking within the agency, and to help connect cultural considerations and into what are often perceived and framed as environmental problems. And I think a couple of other people mentioned that. I'm really encouraged, though. What I see is a growing integration of social sciences into a lot of research around climate change and ecosystem-based management and food systems. Related to this idea of listening and learning and voice and participation, I created an oral history archive at NOAA about 16 years ago, that now houses about 2,000 long-form audio and transcribed oral histories of people from all over fisheries around the United States. And it's just an incredibly powerful way to sit and listen to someone who probably, may not feel comfortable talking to you in that depth and sharing that experience in that way. And it's just such a privilege for me to be able to listen to these stories that are crowdsourced from, at the moment, probably about 80 different institutions and contributors. And now we're expanding that collection to cover climate, weather, and other aspects of the NOAA portfolio and mission. And finally, I wanted to pick up on something that Yoshi said about this idea of our identity. I think my introduction is a lot about my own identity, and that understanding that and that awareness of that helps us understand where we've, gone wrong in our past research, not only as individual researchers, but also as institutions, and understanding how our organizational structures and the relationships that underlie fisheries science and scientists impact the work that we do, the choices we make on what to work on, and how we even frame questions and problems and who we include in the process. So that's the sort of lens that I look through when I think about the critical intersections of climate, food, and culture, and if I may add equity. It's this idea of fish for whom, by whom, for what? What are we trying to create and so support and sustain? How do our regulations and policies hinder or support those outcomes? How do we reconnect our land and sea-based food systems, removing silos and bringing all our expertise to bear on the full spectrum of food producers and food systems? And how do we sort of, through a sustainability science lens, bring together all our knowledge to bear to help resolve or inform our policy decisions around these, wicked problems, or these very dynamic and challenging problems, and in a constantly changing environment. So I'm really happy to be here, very excited to talk to you all, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here with us today. We're already hearing so many incredible themes across all of your thoughts and comments. So for the next session of the webinar, what we'll be doing is doing a bit of a discussion to begin pulling at some of that connective tissue that we've already started to highlight. And I'd like to start by drilling down into a couple of key terms that a few of our speakers have already brought up in their introductions. And the first one is about the relationship between identities and histories and sociocultural contexts. So I'll start by asking to bring us into these fishing communities and talk a bit more about the sociocultural contexts that shape how we understand and respond to climate change. Cindy, could you tell us about some of the ways in which individual or collective identity is related to fishing in your work? How do people see themselves as part of a food system? What does that food system look like? And then maybe can you kind of add in climate change to that cultural context? How does climate change start to interact with that sense of identity, those ways of making a living or providing other stressors and community priorities?
Yeah, thank you. So I have done a lot of work in the U.S. Virgin Islands. That's where I did my dissertation research. Kind of the classic thing of I went for supposedly 6 months and stayed for almost 3 years. And, as an anthropologist, ethnographic research, participant observation, so I spent days, at the fish market, which is really just a kind of a makeshift wooden, not even building, but shelter where the guys would sell fish out of their coolers. I'd go on spearfishing trips with them, et cetera. And, kind of couple that with going to all of the public meetings related to fisheries or any kind of environmental issues there. So I saw sort of the dynamics of interaction, right, among the fishers themselves, the fishers with their environment, the fishers with managers and with scientists and other stakeholders. And the thing that I can say in terms of identity is that, absolutely they see themselves as food producers. That is their identity. They are fishermen. And I say fishermen, there's even the couple fisher women would still refer to themselves as fishermen. But in the U.S. Virgin Islands, these are small scale fisheries, some pelagics, but a lot of reef fisheries. Almost all the landings stay on island. So they truly are feeding the local population, right? So not only island residents and those who live there, but also the tourism industry. One thing in particular, thinking about sort of climate change or the important role that these fishers play, in I believe it was 2017 or 2018, getting my hurricanes mixed up here. But Hurricane Maria and Irma and Maria came through the U.S., well, the whole Caribbean, but really, devastated Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. I visited shortly after, but I mean, people were without power for, 8 months after. And so in this situation, they don't have refrigeration, right? They can't purchase foods and frozen foods or, even to the extent they could get their hands on them and keep them for longer. So every single day, the fishermen were feeding the island food. And, that's a really important role that they play, right? Not only in, so their livelihoods not only contribute to themselves as individuals, and that's their individual identity, but to this island community. They played a huge role in those kinds of, in that kind of context. In terms of, climate change and kind of what that means for them in that role, I think climate change is one of several cumulative impacts at this point. Sure, many in the community are just as aware as any of us about these changes, if not more so. They're, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, they're seeing them on a daily basis. But, this is just one more thing. They've been dealing with environmental degradation. They've been dealing with economic issues. I mean, places in particular, the Virgin Islands, poverty, economic shifts, increasing regulations, right? So these are just cumulative. And in many cases, they don't have the luxury of worrying about something that could have maybe a drastic impact on themselves, on their individual livelihoods, 10 years from now, whenever they need to feed their families now and they need to feed the people on the island now. So I think that that's another important piece, and I think we see that not just with fishing communities, but in many communities and in many different sectors and different communities and globally, right? That this is just one of another impact, right? Another cumulative impact. I'm just looking at my notes here. And one other thing I wanted to mention too is that, in the Virgin Islands, and we see this throughout the Caribbean, fishing is often one of many different occupations, right, that these individuals use to get through their daily lives. In particular, in St. Croix, there's the oil refinery, which I believe was just shut down again. But for environmental reasons, but often the fishers over the years they'll work for the oil refinery for a while, and then if something happens with that position, then they're fishing. Sometimes, and after hurricanes, they are doing construction. So, and this is a really common thing with fishing communities, particularly in the Caribbean, but I would imagine throughout the world as well, other island-based communities, this idea of occupational multiplicity. And so, yet at the same time, even though they're doing these different roles and different occupations, fishing is still what they are, right? They are a fisher. They are a fisherman. Their father was a fisherman. Their grandfather was a fisherman, et cetera. So, and I'm sure that others have things they could add, so I will leave it there.
Thanks so much, Cindy. Let's layer on a bit of the sense of scope and scale that many of you brought up in your introductions to keep building the richness here. Patricia, I know you've drawn out a lot of these connections that Cindy, you were just talking about between individual fishers or fishing communities and this much broader sense of marine resource management or even policy considerations for the nation as a whole. So could you tell us how you think about those linkages between scope and scale? What's important to consider when we're moving between all of these levels?
Yeah, thanks, Cindy, for that. That was definitely thought-provoking. I especially pick up on this idea of these multiple impacts and cumulative effects. I wanted to step back and think a little bit about what we were talking about in terms of how do people think about, fishermen think about how their relationship to what they catch. And I think that is related to scale. So you may find in a small village, and even under certain circumstances, that people really recognize that they're catching something that is food. And then you may have in a completely different space people who will tell you that they are killing fish. And they don't mean that in a bad way. They just mean that that's their job, is to kill fish and bring it to market. But it's not about this like intimate understanding or distribution to the community, like that picture I had on my slide where you see community members helping to pull in a net, knowing that will give them part of the catch, that they can participate and be a part of that. And so there's that sort of scale in terms of size and relationship. But there's also, when we think about fishing communities, I tend to overemphasize fishermen and harvesters in particular. And we don't think of that scope to broaden the scope. If we think of fishermen as having, they have limited power to influence the regulations and policies that affect their work, imagine the person who is working for a temp agency at a processing plant who, can't determine their work hours, doesn't, determine when fish come in or what type of fish they're even harvesting. There's just these distances away from the power center that I think are important to recognize. And the people that aren't normally in our pictures, that I think when I put my pictures up to this group, I said, oh my God, where are all the women? And I think the women really are in the processing sector, and they are in the households doing the other things, and they are missing, but they are part of this fishing community as defined by National Standard 8. The other thing I would like to pick up on that Cindy said was this idea of, I know it was related to something she said, but it's this idea that some fishing communities are kind of standalone. Think of like a little down east Maine place, or a little, possibly an island in the Caribbean, although there's so many things layered now with tourism and gentrification and stuff. But then there's other communities that are nestled into much larger city centers like Boston or New York. These places have fishing communities within them. So how we define that and how we look at it is important. And the last thing I'll add as food for thought is this scale of policy thought to it. It's just even hearing Emily talking, it made me, or no, Ariella talking, it made me realize that I'm not thinking still broad enough. and that we get caught in our own limited blinders. And so I had been probably working for 10 years on questions around national standard aid and fishing communities in the Magnuson-Stevens Act, when I, sort of only stumbled upon the fact that National Standard 1 is really the one that talks about food production. And I had really been focusing my attention to, in some ways, the wrong standard. And that talking about food, just like the introduction, really enables us to think about much broader systems of power, influence, policy, regulation, and participation, and those greater benefits to the nation in terms of health. So those are bringing in some ideas around scope and scale into the discussion. Certainly not complete, but yeah, interested to hear what others have to say.
Oh, thank you so much, Patricia. I think from these first two questions, we're really getting a sense of the richness and depth of the information that you all have access to as social scientists and your positions within your various organizations. So we'll add one more layer in here, and I'll start with Monica and Yoshi, because you brought this up so powerfully in your introductions, but I know all four of our speakers think very deeply about the relationship between equity, justice, and resilience. So as we've seen even more powerfully over the past 2 years, the impacts of climate change interact with and exacerbate the impacts of other disasters like hurricanes, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And they also amplify the inequities that are already present. So in your work, how do you think about topics like climate change research and planning or resource management through that lens of equity and justice, really kind of putting that at the center of your work? What's important to consider here, and are there opportunities to think about how best to build and maintain a culturally relevant food system that is just and is also climate resilient? And I'll turn it over to Monica first, and then Yoshi, but I invite all of our speakers to jump in.
Yeah, those are the big questions, I think. And everybody here already, this word power has come up so many times, and I don't think it's coincidental here. And I'll situate this kind of just within my own draw into this work. And I tell a lot of folks I didn't start off as a person who all about the environment and sustainability as an undergrad. To me, studying environmental change was a way to better understand the dynamics of our society, right? And particularly around racial inequalities. So for me, it was always about how do I understand the ways that formations of racial difference articulate and show themselves in this so-called post-racial moment, right? So this era of climate change, this era of, post-civil rights, right? We still have these inequalities manifesting. How is that, right? And, we've heard several of us mention how it's, it shouldn't, we start the conversation by saying we know that existing inequalities are going to be amplified by climate change, right? That's no longer, to me, right? That's not a question we need to investigate, right? We already know that. So if we're going to start from there, then how do we move forward? And, and I think this is for me, I learned this through working between communities, especially with fishing communities, in beginning to, if you will, and I call this kind of unlearning in some ways, a way of thinking about the environment that felt so overdetermined by kind of climate change research, by the environmental sciences, by the discourse of conservation. And not that those are bad things, but they're very powerful discourses, right? And when we, these jargony terms, discourse rhetoric, right? It's how we learn how to think about things. And there's nothing wrong with it, but I think part of the challenge is when we take them for granted as the inherent way to see these problems, it also gives us a kind of set of blinders, right? Or at least that's how I felt. And working in communities and on the ground, and also kind of tacking between all the meetings, working with scientists, collaborators, who are great people, incredibly intelligent, hearts in the right place people. It felt like they were almost approaching this same issue, right? Everybody wants a future for Louisiana. Everyone wants a future for coastal Louisiana, but they're approaching it from very different discursive frameworks, different imaginative frameworks. And for me, to get at that question of justice and equity, I had to step outside the language of environmental restoration, of natural processes, right? And I could say more about this too, but it was actually just as another expert, right? As another social scientist coming in, it was so important to be able to actually try and see the world from the perspective of the fishing communities that I worked with. And this made me see too how to approach this question of equity and justice, right? And I see it more, Yoshi, you said this, kind of putting social equity at the center of ocean science and ocean governance, and to me, that's really kind of the key point here, right? So how do we put things like addressing economic inequality, racial inequality at the center? And these are questions about power. And, I wouldn't sit here and say that that's an easy thing to do, but in the context of at least my work, I've kind of asked this through the lens of, well, all right, so how do we align things like political sovereignty for indigenous communities with climate change research? If our climate change research is directly informing development policies, how can we align that with a battle for more affordable housing, right? And more environmentally resilient housing at the same time, right? Food security and food sovereignty, right? These things don't need to be held in separate ways. Like, in fact, I think everybody, especially the scientists and experts involved in climate change research, that has a direct bearing on policy, right? People's lives. If we can begin to see it as an opportunity to help share that power, right? Use your power for good. So hook into and work with community-based organizations or other folks who've been fighting for things like civil rights, like economic autonomy and access to living wages. Is there a way we can tie these things together, right? Because ultimately climate change is going to be cultural change for all cultures around the world, right? So there's no, personally, right, again, not an easy, let's fix this, but I think we're absolutely in a position to be able to do that if we can step outside the kind of frameworks that we teach, that we inherit, right, that are not bad ones, but we need to expand it and get a little bit more, creative about what we can really do when we do things like, putting science in the service of people, right, and putting equity on equal footing with the environment, right, and also seeing how environmental policy can be a route to getting there, right? I'm always kind of looking for that, like how can we use the power happening over here to help collaborate and work with these people who've been fighting for this over here, whether it's fishermen, fighting for the right to be able to have subsistence lifestyles and economies in an increasingly unequal world driven by global capitalism, right? That would otherwise not care. So I'm getting in my feelings here. Yoshi, I feel like you have a lot to put in here as well.
I gotta say, it's just amazing. Thank you very much, Monica, Cynthia, and Patricia. So brave and so, out there. And I kind of feel the, scientists, including us, we really have to admit, like Monica said, we've been, more or less complicit about it. Not really about our hurt, but we're part of the institution, we're part of the approaches, and I tell you the truth, we want to write the things which are interesting, and sometimes it's not, particularly directly towards a solution. But what we really looking for here is kind of like a solidarity. Who's our client, and it's very, like Monica said, and like Cindy said, yes, it's another thing, and but and Patricia said, it's right there, they're right there, they're real. There's real issues people are just facing every day, and sometimes working with other scientists, they say, but where's the data? And then I'm saying, okay, well, let's look at your data. So for instance, sometimes I talk to the fisheries scientists in the US, and it's like, US fisheries are very sustainable, we're doing great. And then I say, well, if we look at the data, a lot of US seafood consumption is coming from somewhere else. So if we actually expand your fishing definition from just only the US fishery to the seafood consumption, which we actually think is the part of fishing, it doesn't look like doing well at all, you know? So it really is consider what the data is all about, what is real. And to tell you the truth, the word global, it's just a horror thing. You know, we just tend to use it, but there's nothing inside of it. We all know. And what's real and what's global is really coming from the community and the region, and that's the place where the policy could work. And so when we actually look at the policy and see the use of data, which is available, which is something collectible, which is something sort of perpetuating the power and discourse and narrative and all this, what happens is we tend to respond what immediately out there rather than considering underlying vulnerability, underlying issues and perpetuating powers. And so I really think that we really need to look at this, and that's what I'm saying as a social equity, as a center of it. So how are we going to do this? And people question, one of the things which I think is really important is for us to understand there's basically two things about the social scientist, and you know, I'm talking in front of my fellows, so correct me if I'm wrong. You know, yes, we do produce the data, real data, talking to the humans, but it's right there. And we also bring it with a critical perspective. The second part is really important. So I'm just begging all my colleagues in the disciplinary fellows, trying to engage with the second part, not just asking data to combine your natural science, because it's a category mistake. Last things I wanted to say about the culture. You know, I worked in Palau, and I was with a fellow fisherman, and I was also kind of like helped by a lot of my female friends over there, and the other day I was talking to one of the Palau guy talking about their illegal fishing, and you know, their water is so huge they can't sort of manage it and govern it, but they're doing better because I think about like 3-4 years ago they actually blowed Indonesian illegal fishing boat, and he was saying that taught them a lesson. And then I was thinking, you know, if this is coming out of Palauan women's mouths, I don't think they will be proud of it. I don't think they will say we blowed it and then taught them a lesson. It's just such a representation of the strong masculinity, you know. And then I don't think that represents the Palauan culture, but it represents some of the hearings which I hear in somewhere people who believes enforcement is the only way. So I'm sorry, I was just out of things. We got to be careful about the culture, and we got to be careful about what we are thinking. We really got to be careful about some of the discourse about, you know, war against something, you know. That's not the way to go, you know, as far as ocean concerns. That's my opinion. But thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing all of these really powerful things to keep in mind about just really putting people in power at the center of this research, and not just saying that we should do that, but giving very, very tangible examples of what it looks like to do that, what that entails, what that takes. So following up on that, since a couple of our speakers have just given some pretty specific recommendations to colleagues that we work with in interdisciplinary research spaces, or thinking about really paying attention to the kinds of knowledge and expertise that tend to dominate these conversations about marine resources, about ocean governance, about climate adaptation. I'd like to just spend a couple minutes zooming in on some research directions. And our last kind of cluster of questions before we open up to audience Q&A really invite our panelists to assess the current state of the field and look ahead to potential next steps, new directions, or climate futures. So first, what are the research or methodological gaps for connecting food, culture, and climate, and I'll throw in equity there as well, through the lens of fishing and coastal communities? What approaches do you think are really needed here, and what might they look like in practice? And I'll start with you here, Patricia.
I was just thinking a little bit about something that Yoshi said about bias, and I think that it's related to one step we might take next, and hopefully this will be a bit more of a discussion, but it reminds me of early literature that really stuck with me over all these years. One was Robert Chambers. I don't know if the others on this call are familiar with him, but this idea of whose reality counts, putting the last first. It's sort of simple stuff, but it's for some reason gets lost in the shuffle. And another one, which is Paulo Freire's not liberation theology, but this idea of building awareness is already something that just by knowing, then we are moved to action, that we understand how to self-regulate, but we need to be aware of what's happening. And I think that that's something that we need to do internally and externally. People are just now, I think, in many ways coming to terms with the fact that climate change is real, that it's around the corner, that it's going to change the way we live and the way we do things. But simultaneously, internally, we need this shift, which is, okay, the tools of my science have gotten me this far. What do I need to do to reflect and consider how I need to retool, rethink, and reframe the issues that I work on? And who do I work with? Looking around and saying, like, who am I partnering with? Who are we hiring? What does the structure of our organizations look like? Are they reflective? It's not enough for us to put equity in the middle. It would be kind of inauthentic if we had this group of people that didn't fall or have connections to these external groups not represented within these organizations. And we have really big barriers in ocean science in particular to diversity in our ocean sciences for very well documented lack of pathways, and those are things that we need to put some energy into: mentoring, reaching out, and I'll stop there for the moment. There's probably other things that will come up, but I really do want this to be more of a conversation for this question.
Can I piggyback off that?
Please do.
Yeah, I like that, and I think, I think of this a lot too, is how do we shift the culture of science, right? And it gets back to that question of like justice, equity, but also kind of how we do these things differently. And, Patricia, listening to you now and thinking about, like, for me, working in multiple departments, where we're training ocean scientists or people who might end up being environmental managers, coastal managers in the future. And then I also, work in African American studies, and I work with in cultural anthropology, and they have very different career trajectories probably. But I think it starts a lot there. And one thing I love about anthropology, which I think is just something that everybody should kind of have to take and deal with, is that kind of grappling of our positionality in kind of how we're teaching things and how we come to think about things. And to me, part of shifting that culture and doing research differently does start with our training. There's, I think, a lot of good arguments to have people in specialized training and knowledge, but the interdisciplinary training beyond just interdisciplinary natural sciences is so key, I think, to early on, exposing our colleagues to these ideas of traditional knowledge and the colonial contexts through which what we think about as science with a capital S exists, that informs every approach we take, right? And I don't think this is just an academic exercise, because I do think it ultimately shapes the ways that we design the research questions. And then, when our students eventually come to be in the positions of making decisions, that they start to think about these things. So this is both, I think, yes, we can have more diversity, equity, inclusion, all of that, which is both good, but also, somewhat problematic in some ways. The direction NSF's trying to go to do interdisciplinary work, we have to think about why that matters. And it's not just about putting more people of color on committees, right? It's also about the ideas and values that center the science that is doing this work. So that's a big part of it, both the grants, but also the training, right? Who are you teaching? not just who are you teaching to, but whose text, are we teaching like Robin Kimmer's work? Are we teaching Kyle White Powers' work to our future conservation scientists?
Thanks, Monica. And yes, Yoshi and Cindy, I know you both probably have some thoughts on this as well, related to fishermen being the experts, centering community priorities, things like that. So Cindy, we'll go to you next.
Okay, sure. I was actually gonna change or piggyback on Monica a little bit to talk about interdisciplinary stuff, because as I mentioned, so we have this interdisciplinary PhD program, and it's been going on for years, but I think that I'm excited by sort of my generation of researchers coming in to these positions of being the ones who have the opportunity to train interdisciplinary scientists, because we were in fact trained interdisciplinarily, right? I mean, I think especially, there's a lot of issues in academia in terms of your, I want to say stovepipe, but I don't think that's the right analogy, but your separate silos, and, the idea that, I'm an ecologist, and I included that oceanographer, like that's my interdisciplinary research, and I'm not saying that research is bad, but I think to really address, we were talking earlier about these underlying issues, we need to be more inclusive, right? I mean, it has to go beyond even the non-economic social scientists and include the culture, the history, right? To really be able to understand these, I think Patricia said earlier, right? These wicked problems that are just, there is kind of no end goal of these problems, right? We don't know what we're even trying to achieve yet. The goalpost is constantly moving, and we need to be able to train people and our future scientists, right, to think truly interdisciplinarily. And I'll just give one little tidbit, and then I'll pass it over. But I teach a human dimensions course. Human dimensions, I hate that term, but that's what it's called. Human dimensions of coastal management. And we have students that come in from all different backgrounds: engineering, economics, biology, et cetera. And I teach about resilience. And I talked about, I taught about the underlying causes. There is no such thing, right, as a natural disaster. You can have a triggering event and a hazard, but it's these underlying social conditions that create the disaster. And this was something new to these students, and I love that. I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be teaching and training now. So I'll pass it on. Thanks.
Go? Yeah, thank you. Cindy, brilliant. And then I'm showing the audience, some people going like, what do you mean by there is no natural disaster? And then I'm going to pick up. So in 2011, about 10 years ago, I was in Japan, in Tokyo. And so in March, when the tsunami happened, I was right there with my 2-week-old daughter and a really tiny house, but it was just far, but not far enough to be free from Fukushima, which is very worried and scared and everything. And the Fukushima issue wasn't really a natural disaster. And then afterwards, I just had a chance to go around the coast and, talking to the people. And I mean, traditional knowledge, so forth. But there was a sign saying tsunami will come up here, leave higher place than this place. And then I think maybe they exposed a couple of places, but that's really real. It's just every village, you have the storm, every place, you got the sign says it. But people couldn't really live up in hills because they have to engage with fishing, they have to consider about perishability, they got to take the market, they have to buy the land as well. And obviously, more vulnerable, things are cheaper. So there you go, class and everything. So that's what it is. And that's, I hope what you meant, as in there's no such things called natural disaster. There's always underlying vulnerability, which exacerbates impact and even to huge impact, issues with disaster. And I'm going to move to a little bit of teaching. When I was taught a long time ago, doing anthropology, I didn't really have to worry about anything else except, doing something interesting, juxtaposing, looking into culture, oceans and traveling and the interdisciplinary. It's all cool. But now things are different. The climate change, it's just everybody is exposed. And not just simply because being successful and rich and, high elite and, all those things wouldn't protect them anymore. That's what we felt in Seattle over here, where most rich people run in the neighborhood, but they have to suffer with air pollution and everything. They probably just flew off with a helicopter somewhere, but there's no escape for it. So it's everybody's risk, and which actually gave us a chance to say, what's wrong, what doesn't make sense. And I'm going to give sort of three things. What I'm doing is, if you don't mind, one is a policy analysis, really looking at us to think about what's the problem. So when you actually put three very different problems, put it together, such as IUU, it doesn't make sense from a policy standpoint. Why are you doing that? Just because it's easy to pronounce or something? So something like a core design. Core design is kind of like a tech word, but it basically means building up together. Why do you core design marine protected area, which is already a word? So again, it really doesn't make sense to me. And it's something like a relational well-being, which is extremely important. And there's something, Patricia, you said about it. In the blue economy, who are you partnering with? Are you really looking at the well-being of the community, but also look at the well-being of the company that you're working with? I'm sure in a company or in the organization, there are people thinking, hey, maybe we want to change our approach. Maybe we want to do something else, but the structure and the governance of the company and something is maybe not working well. So, those are things we really have to think about it. So, it's a very, high stake place, but, what I can do at least to my student and the colleagues is just speak loudly. Things doesn't make sense to me, and hoping somebody makes sense to me, but yeah, bit inconclusive.
Yoshi, what you just said reminded me a little bit. What I'm kind of getting from this is, one, this idea of something that Cindy said about we need a vision, like we need something that actually glues this together that people understand, and there's a sort of a destination that we're trying to get to that people agree on. It's probably Pollyanna of me, but it's also this like need for just common language and understanding. It's cultural shift and change. I was thinking my son, my 11-year-old, came home with a little worksheet and he was excited. He just had science class, and the worksheet was, what is a scientist? And at the top, it had a picture of an older white man with a lab coat and a chemical beaker. And it said, what are the characteristics of a scientist? And for those, it was beautiful. He had filled in creativity, innovation, hard work, etc. But then when it went to the methods, it was all the scientific process. And this is what we're teaching. Like, my son is the future of this world, as are all our children. And if they're being indoctrinated right now in a space that's probably the most left-leaning spaces in the American, social landscape, that this is what a scientist is, it makes me worry a little bit. We need those kids to be given the language and the tools to understand. And so we can shift from, I work alongside people who don't understand or even know what grounded theory is, and they don't think that that's a legitimate way of gathering or analyzing data, or it's less than somehow. And if our work is less than, and equity needs to be central, and we're the ones that are bringing that language to the table, there's a disconnect between what we know and what we can do and how we might influence. So I love seeing all these faces today, and some of which are new, and I hope to continue to connect, because I do think that the more that we talk to each other, it is important for us to talk to each other, but then it's also important for us to go and kind of cross-pollinate and I think we need each other for more like moral support than anything, but for us to get out of our chambers and to get in and to talk to people who are and engage in multidisciplinary work and inform and start with those beginning basic things that Cindy mentioned about, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Like sometimes it is just baby steps, and then people will start to kind of get it.
Quickly say, there are people coming from natural science or, really wanting to learn policies and critical perspectives and all this. I get the approach all the time, and, they're very brave, and I had this wonderful PhD student who done fisheries and an ecologist, and then she just had a gap before the postdoc, and then she just joined us to learn about social science, and it was really great. Her name is Seema, and and she just ended up producing the best policy analysis. So this is really not the rocket science again, but it's so I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of people and young scientists and just happen to be female that way, but really trying to cross the boundaries, and I just really admire and acknowledge that.
I think that's important to point out too. I've met a lot of natural scientists who've put in the time, who've sought out social science advisors in their PhD training and in their professional work, and they're really, I think, it's hard. It takes time, in the same ways that all of us had to familiarize ourselves with the language of science, without, at least I didn't have that background, right? And I think we all have varying levels of that, but what it means, it's almost like learning another language, right? It takes a level of commitment that it's not enough to just put us, this is why we all, have like group therapy sessions when all the environmental anthropologists get together. It's not enough to just put one social scientist on the grant proposal and assume you're going to get diversity, equity, inclusion, and the human dimension all in one,
I think technology, sorry. I think technology is on our side, that we will, there are more opportunities out there to help us through, just different platforms that are going to enable us to contribute in a way. It's just, things are slow, right? Although working with USDA, I can't use a Google Drive, for example. We have to send files to each other, which is a little discouraging. But I'm hoping that that technology is going to help us get to where we're trying to go, and we are on our way there.
Always a challenge with technological affordances. Yes. This is such a passionate and powerful call for not just interdisciplinarity, but a very specific kind of grounded and humanistic interdisciplinarity. Thank you so much. I'll also just throw in a quick reminder to everyone, as you'll see in the chat, if you do have questions for our wonderful panel here, you can go ahead and put those into the Q&A box. And while everyone is thinking, I will ask our panelists to close out this portion of the discussion by thinking about reflecting on one final, admittedly quite broad question, which is, based on your work and based on our conversation today, what are some of the most significant sociocultural dimensions of adaptation and resilience? What would you like us all to walk away thinking about? And we gave this question to our panelists in advance and suggested we can think about in what ways do cultural practices, knowledge, or relationships facilitate adaptation and resilience, and in what ways are they threatened by all of those vulnerabilities that coastal communities already bear or are forced to bear? Or what are the ramifications for individuals and communities when significant practices or places change or are lost? But really, I invite any final reflections on how we want to connect those ideas. And is it okay if I start with you, Cindy?
Sure. I think my mind's a little crazy now because I had prepared certain things, but now I'm thinking very differently. So I think, well, we haven't talked a lot about it, so I'll just go with what I wrote down. And I think, you know, one of the challenges and things that we need to focus on moving forward is, and we got a little away from fishing and fishing communities as well, I think. But so we go back to that and we think about, you know, experiential knowledge, traditional knowledge, local knowledge, whatever you want to call it. But anything that is, you know, not the typical doing biological surveys or fisheries counts or what have you. You know, we don't really have a way to include that kind of experiential knowledge and other ways of knowing into our management and into at least in the U.S. and with many of our systems in, you know, the Western science system. And I think that there's a lot of information that and knowledge and a wealth of knowledge that can be tapped there. But I think the fact that we don't have a way to incorporate that into the processes as they are now just underscores this lack of equity and lack of justice, right? And lack of acceptance of these different ways of knowing. And I think, you know, there's a lot we can learn from that, but then you put climate change on top, and again, it's this huge wicked problem. And I think, you know, something that's really resonated today from what the other speakers have said, you know, is this idea of these underlying issues and these underlying causes, and that, you know, it's great to try to solve climate change and fix this problem, but what are those underlying issues? And that, you know, I think if we do want to bring humans and equity and culture and society to the forefront, then that's what we need to focus on because there are those underlying drivers. So, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cindy. I'll invite our other speakers to jump in as they're ready. Yoshi, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I'm not going to say that. Such an inspiration. Thank you. So when so a colleague of mine, working in Japan as an anthropologist, I've been looking at the Minamata village for a long time, and this is a village which has been impacted by the cadmium and the mercury pollutions, and you know, it's just horrifying story. And both industry and the government took a long time to respond it. You know, they put a lot of scientists to say, no, it's not really. And so it's just it's just completely horrifying environmental injustice and happening in both fisheries and in oceans. And what actually, you know, helped those people to fight against those, you know, hideous power, you know, the network of the government and in industry was really the scientists and academics. And then that was a solidarity there. And my colleague of mine is looking at this and, you know, trying to save this institutional knowledge, but it's just decaying because the people who actually were students at the time getting old, you know, people in Minamata is getting old, you know, there's no funding or anything whatsoever. So it's just really hard to bring. I really think this type of institutional knowledge, and there's just tons of people in the world who's fighting against, you know, those horrifying alliance network right now. And I kind of think, you know, for the climate adaptation, if you want to do it equitably, I think that's really important. Having said that, those who are actually, you know, think about like money will actually solve the issues, you know, please tell those money people, you know, you can't really solve the issues in about 2 years with your funding. If you want to fund anything, just putting on the capacity building, putting on the community, trying to look for the long-term solution, and then that will probably be worthwhile spending the money. So yeah, so there you go. I'll pass it to other colleagues.
Happy to jump in. Oh, please go ahead, Monica.
Go ahead, Patricia.
I would add because I think our conversation steered a little bit away from, I don't want to necessarily call them consumers, but the ultimate users of the fish that are caught and distributed. I just wanted to put something out there related to that, and just to think about it as, you know, we need engagement at lots of different levels. We have these, I think I don't know if they're nationwide, but I know that in Massachusetts and in other states in the Northeast, we have these food policy councils. In fisheries, I feel like we need the public more engaged. They've been confused. They've seen like accordion things of what they can eat and what they can't eat. It's just gotten too complicated to the point that I think that people are actually just like avoiding eating fish. And I do believe that my 11-year-old, when he was 6, should have been able to walk into a fish market and make decent choices about what would be good for him to eat. And, that somebody that has a minimum wage salary can have access to fish. Because I do, think that distributional issue is really important. So, just a reminder for us to think about food deserts and access and engagement and knowledge and education and participation in this. That, if we look at who's showing up at Marine Fisheries Management Council meetings or who's engaged, it does mirror the same sort of obstacles that we see with the ocean science scientists coming through the pipelines. We also see that, I think, in the U.S. Through who's eating fish and what kind of fish that they're eating and the choices that we're making about the fish that we catch and how it's distributed. So.
All right, now I have 3 things. I want to keep it short here if I can. And I hope it touches on everything other folks have said here. But I think solidarity, that word came up. I think Yoshi, you brought it up. It's been kind of tossed around here. We have to decide, right? And we as a science community across all of natural, human, whatever sciences, right? We have to decide to put what values we're going to put at the center of our work, right? And it can't always be the values of our funders. And I think it's really important that we're brave and encourage our colleagues to do this and make these choices as we move forward into these projects. Because again, hitting on this question about power, right? Science does have a lot of power in our society, even though it can be under attack at times, it's still there. The second thing I'll say too is I've been thinking a lot about outreach, public engagement, bottom-up type work. How do we integrate people's voices into coastal planning, fisheries planning, whatever it might be? And I really feel like what's been sticking with me is what the difference is between accounting for communities, right, versus accountability to them. And I think that's an important shift to be making when we do this work, so that we're not just turning community engagement into yet another checking the box thing, right? I'm sure if you haven't already heard this term all the time, you will. I think that's an important shift to make. And then, finally, in terms of thinking about how we do science, right, and both who are our scientists, so can we do more than just, talk to and try to gather traditional ecological knowledge or account for it, but actually, pay people to work, hire people from communities, like treat them with the same level of respect and professionalization, right, that we extend to ourselves, to our graduate students, to our undergrads. This is not bias in science, right? It's pretty standard to compensate people for their knowledge and value across all of our fields. So, that matters, right? And I will say I do think there are many successful examples of doing these kinds of things. So, and I think all of us are kind of pointing to that, like, yes, we need to be critical, but we're not sitting here saying that there aren't agencies or organizations or research groups that have been successful, right? But it's a cultural project, right? Climate change is about cultural change, and it is structured by the conditions, like the underlying conditions that have brought us here, but it's not confined by that. It's only confined by the priorities and values we choose to center on our work going forward. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, everyone. Yes, I hope you can feel the applause that is happening, even if you can't hear it. So many wonderful, rich thoughts to leave all of us with. So I'll just express my thanks to all of you again, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Amber Campbell with USDA, who will be providing us some final closing thoughts to give us all some key takeaways. And folks in the audience, if you haven't checked the chat yet, you'll find email addresses for all of our speakers today if you would like to follow up with any of them individually. So Amber, I pass the mic to you. Oh, Amber, we're not hearing you.
Okay, does that work? I tried muting.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, I was telling you how wonderful you are, and how much I enjoyed listening to the panel. And I think you brought up some really important points of just, at least for me, like what struck me in terms of if I was watching this as sort of like a physical or a natural scientist, and what I could see coming out in terms of what would be like, how can human-centered approaches to understanding the world really contribute to our efforts in order to like, how do we deal with climate change, right? And it's, to me, is these issues of context and positionality and lived experience. So both understanding like what is the historical and the policy-driven context, like where are people living and dealing with these situations? How have we created this as a human society? Like how have we enacted the things that led to the situation we're in? And how can we alter that going forward? Or how can we make sure that what we do going forward isn't just reenacting or reestablishing those inequitable distributions of power, and ways that people are kind of having a position to play in that situation? So are we creating people who are capable of thinking that other forms of knowledge are useful or can be helpful in better understanding the situation we're in? And how can those sort of just data points we have, or the data we have about like this is the environmental remediation activity that should be going on, to recognizing what will that mean in terms of the lived experiences of the people that it's going to impact, and how that really needs to be valued and understood in a better way in order for us to have a hope of enacting policies or creating programs, or doing our research in a way that is more equitable in the future. That is, I mean, I think those are the big things for me. I think after that, I was also supposed to remind everyone that there is another webinar coming up in 2 weeks on October 12th. Oh, and thanking our planning committee. This is the whole list. Emily, obviously, was our moderator today. We have Brianna Farber from the DOE, who was in the background for this webinar, Ariella Zeikerman, that you heard from earlier, myself, and Austin Sheets, who you may have seen in the chat, that is really kind of the pulling us all together in terms of keeping the logistics going. And a special thanks to Tia Biggs from USGCRP, Chelsea Combest-Friedman from NOAA, Gia Lee from World Bank, formerly EPA, and the NOAA Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, also known as RISA, for their support of our program. And there's the list. So if you have any questions about the upcoming webinar, you can email Austin. And there's the list of speakers for the last in our series, Putting Culture into Practice, the Role of Social Science in Building Resilient and Adaptive Food Systems.